Okay, I thought this would be a good way to do a 1 month update, mostly for myself, but also as a way to just provide an update as required by the challenge. So I decided to sign up for this, mostly so I'd have a good reason to learn more about visual effects from the front end. So we have to share our progress. We have an entire 5 months to complete our work, and the goal was to do visual effects for a scene that they provided. So I'd never done most of this before, and since they already had a project set up for Houdini, I loaded that and could see their default stuff. And then I went through the tutorials from Side Effects, some of the basic tutorials, went through the basics a couple of times just to make sure I had the very basics down. Then did a test render of each layer so that I could bring it into Vegas Pro, which is my editor of choice, just to add some basic special effects. That was one of my first updates. And then kept going through and learning basically a lot of the basics in Houdini. I've been making pretty good progress. So this was the initial project as brought in from Rebelway. Most of that I didn't know what I was looking at. And I chose this giant of a product, Houdini, because of the project that Rebelway supplied. Didn't really understand why a lot of the things weren't textured, but it turns out the textures for most of the project weren't included. That's fine. I needed to learn how to create the textures and apply them, and I've got some of the basics on that. My current textures still need a lot of work. So I started off creating a project for every stage of my work so that I could track each version and what I was doing in it. So I started off with rendering and played around with lighting and so on and so forth. So I was playing with lighting and shading here. Not a great deal of difference. I did add a sky dome. I'm still going to have to tweak that as well. And then I was also working on texturing, learning how that works in Houdini. Not at all a master yet, but I'm making progress. This particular texture is based on a photograph that I took in the Badlands. And it's okay as a placeholder. Definitely going to have to do some more work on the ground. Then I was experimenting with some terrain. I had a very basic tree. It's also the beginning of where a hole started to appear in the terrain. And that one's literally based just on a sphere. I'm still using that. I started also playing around with different colors for the elements on the cyborg. And this is just changing the color. Hadn't started actually using materials yet. And I'd started working on a terrain plug. That's generally what I call it. That collapsed. And this one doesn't look all that great because it kind of drapes, but it was a beginning. So part of the design choices here was I wanted the terrain to bulge up as though something was coming out and then fall back down. This part doesn't look great, but the first version of the textured plug had been integrated into the base project. So you get an idea of at least some of what I was thinking here. Unfortunately, the hydralisk was still poking up out of the ground, looking a little dorky. But you can also see some of the better shading on the cyborg. In parallel, I was looking at things to do with the cyborg, and that's where I started to look more at materials. I'm definitely going to go for this general look final, but I also want to texture it so it looks a little bit more like carbon fiber. And I was able to add the Vex in here to hang out so that the hydralisk hangs out below the ground a little bit longer. And I'll show that Vex a little bit later. And then I've got some Vex going on here when the Hydra attacks, and so he starts to show some strain in the wires, and then a lot of strain, and so on. And I'll tweak those as well so they're a little smoother. And add glow and that sort of thing later. But then also added some blue coloring when he does his magic or attacks. So then I also added some Vex on the Hydra so that its body brightens up a bit, shows some effects of the hit. And here's the Vex that keeps him underneath the ground. And then when he gets hit by the cyborg attack, this is the Vex that lights him up. And then I've also got some Vex that decomposes him, which you'll see in just a second. And then you can see a little bit of the decomposition. And all of these need tweaking. So this is where I started looking at blending materials, and I discovered that it didn't seem to work in OpenGL. I later found that it's not supported in OpenGL, but it does work in Mantra. So I've got more work to do on that, but at least I know I can blend between the materials over time, and it looks a whole lot better in Mantra. So for the time being, I just have to ignore the fact that he doesn't look right day to day. Okay, so this one's a merge of everything I've been doing to date, and it's not beautiful, but at least I can see some progress. Okay, and there's a bit of a render of some of that. So then I moved on to adding some basic particle effects, figuring how to set that up. So I like some of what's happening here, but needs a lot of tweaking. Add some motion, color variation, that kind of thing. And then for this one, I added some collisions with the Hydralisk. And this one's kind of extreme. Kind of like him bursting through the ground, but I also want to have some vegetation and so on fall down into the hole he's coming out of. So lots of tweaking to go on, but also lots of learning. Making more progress on the collisions. Need to add a lot more detail to these pieces and figure out how to make the debris look better and so on and so forth. But still, I'm neck deep in learning how Houdini works and how to use it best. So this is what the network looks like now, at least for part of it. This is just the plug. And I feel like I understand it maybe half of what's going on in here. The number of features and the way they can interact in Houdini is just incredible. So feels like there's a dozen ways to do any given thing. I do feel like I at least understand what I've done here. There's a few things I'll come back and trim out, like this isn't really needed anymore. I'm not using the interior detail at the moment. I'll probably put that back in at some point. So there's a few things like that.